I did not flinch when Eleanor Vance slid that security report across her polished mahogany desk and said, "Keith, we are putting the executive vice president position on hold indefinitely." She said it just like that, without looking me in the eye, without offering a single word of explanation. It was as if she were telling me that the office coffee maker was out of order, rather than halting a promotion I had spent 15 years earning. What Eleanor did not realize was that I had finally reached my absolute limit. After 15 years of building her security firm from a struggling local business into a major regional player, I was entirely finished playing her manipulative corporate games. My name is Keith Montgomery. I am 48 years old. And this is the story of how I learned the hard way that corporate loyalty only works when it flows in both directions. To understand how I got to this point, you have to know a bit about my background. I am not the type of person who likes to make waves. I never have been. Before entering the corporate world, I spent 10 years in the United States Marine Corps. That experience shaped who I am. It taught me to follow orders, to respect the chain of command, and, most importantly, to take care of the people serving under me. When I was discharged in the year 2001, right after the tragic events of September 11th changed the global security landscape forever, I assumed the corporate world functioned on a similar set of values. I believed that if you did your job exceptionally well, looked out for your team, and remained loyal, the leadership above you would look out for you in return. Unfortunately, I was deeply mistaken about that last part. I started working at Ironclad Risk Management when organizations all across the country were scrambling to adapt to new and complex threats. Eleanor Vance hired me specifically to establish their new corporate and government security division from absolute zero. I created the training programs, designed the protocols, and built the entire department brick by brick. From federal government contracts to executive protection details and corporate data security systems, I developed the processes to handle every single aspect of our operations. 15 years later, Ironclad was pulling in $85 million annually, primarily from federal and corporate contracts that I had secured and managed. I had built that entire operational capability with my own hands, working late nights and sacrificing weekends. Let me tell you about what I actually did for them. In the year 2019, when a highly sophisticated international hacking group attempted to breach our client database, my threat detection protocols caught the intrusion 3 days before it could deploy its payload. That single catch saved the company at least $8 million in regulatory penalties and potential damages. During a major hurricane that devastated the coast, I personally coordinated emergency security operations for 3 Fortune 500 corporations, keeping their operations running smoothly while our competitors went completely dark for weeks. I knew every federal security contractor from Washington to Dallas. I knew which background check agencies were reliable and which ones cut corners. When a crisis occurred at 3 o'clock in the morning, nobody called Eleanor Vance. They called me, and I took care of it, but Eleanor was always the one who showed up for the victory lap. She would stroll into client meetings after my team, and I had resolved every issue, shaking hands with directors and acting as though she had personally authored the security strategies. Meanwhile, I was the one working 16-hour shifts, drinking stale office coffee, and missing my children's school plays just to ensure her contracts remained spotless. The situation with my family made this promotional review absolutely critical. My 17-year-old daughter, Chloe, had recently been diagnosed with a severe spinal condition that required complex corrective surgery. The entire procedure was priced at $180,000, and our private insurance provider had just denied the claim, labeling it an experimental treatment. To make matters worse, my son, Chase, had recently returned from his second military deployment in Syria with severe shrapnel damage to his left leg. The Veterans Affairs Department had been shuffling his medical file between offices for 8 months while he struggled to walk across the living room. On top of that, my wife Diane's local consulting business had taken a massive hit during the recent economic downturn, and we were facing the prospect of refinancing our home just to keep up with our monthly obligations. I was 48 years old, And this executive vice president promotion was no longer about my professional pride. It was about survival. It was about securing the financial stability of my family. For the past 4 years, Eleanor had kept telling me that the promotion was just around the corner. She would mention board approvals, budget restructuring, and corporate alignment, always finding some convenient excuse to delay the paperwork. But she would pat my shoulder and tell me to be patient, assuring me that I was her only choice for the role. So I remained patient. I did the work of an executive vice president while receiving the salary of a mid-level director. I watched as the company hired fresh business school graduates who made more money than I did simply because they possessed master's degrees, despite having zero real-world experience. I stayed quiet even when Eleanor's nephew, Bradley Vance, was fast-tracked to senior director after just 14 months with the company. Bradley, a young man who could not secure a basic office parking structure, was suddenly managing major operations simply because of his last name. But my patience finally ran out on a cold Tuesday afternoon in November. The clock on Eleanor's wall ticked slowly as the reality of her words settled over me. Market conditions. It was the oldest, most transparent excuse in the corporate handbook. I sat there in my best charcoal suit, holding a folder containing 15 years of flawless performance reviews, while she tried to convince me that the company could not afford to pay me for the work I was already doing. This was the same company that had just approved a purchase of $120,000 for brand new custom Italian leather furniture for the executive suites. It was the same company that had posted record-breaking profits for 4 consecutive quarters. Eleanor, I said, keeping my voice flat and controlled. We have been planning this transition for over a year. The job description has been finalized, the budget was allocated during the annual planning session, and I have been executing these exact responsibilities for the last 4 years. If the title is on hold, then we need to adjust my compensation to reflect the actual scope of my daily work. She sighed, a practiced performative sound of corporate exhaustion, and began rearranging the folders on her desk, refusing to look at me. Keith, you know, company policy is very strict about salary bands. We cannot adjust your compensation beyond the director level without the corresponding executive vice president title. Once the board decides the market is stable enough to activate the position, you will be our very first candidate. Our first candidate, I repeated slowly. Not a guarantee. Just a candidate. We have to follow protocol, Keith. It is just the way the board operates. I sat in that chair for a full minute, allowing the silence to stretch between us. I looked at the expensive paintings on her office walls, the brand new mahogany desk, and the gold-plated pen she held in her hand. For 15 years, I had built this company's reputation. I had stayed awake until dawn managing security breaches, missed my son's high school baseball games, and skipped family dinners to ensure Ironclad's federal contracts remained secure. I had done it all because I believed in the promise of mutual loyalty. Now, looking at Eleanor, I realized that loyalty was nothing more than a tool she used to extract maximum value from me at the lowest possible cost. I understand, I said. I stood up, picked up my folder, and walked out of her office. I did not raise my voice. I did not slam the door. But as the door clicked shut behind me, something fundamental changed inside my mind. The loyalty that had bound me to Ironclad for a decade and a half was completely gone. When I returned to my desk, I did not open the security reports or the scheduling files waiting for my attention. Instead, I opened my personal email account. For months, I had been ignoring messages from headhunters, recruiters, and competitors. I had deleted them out of some old-fashioned sense of obligation to Ironclad. But now I opened my inbox and began reading. One message stood out immediately. It was from Julian Pierce, the Chief Executive Officer of Summit Security Group. Summit was our chief competitor in the region. They had started as a small enterprise, but had grown rapidly over the last 5 years, winning several key federal contracts that Ironclad had assumed would belong to them forever. The industry rumor was that Julian operated his firm with transparency and respect, paying his managers well and investing heavily in modern threat detection systems. His email was simple and direct. He wrote that he had been monitoring my work at Ironclad for years, noting that our regional safety and compliance numbers were the absolute best in the state. He offered to buy me a cup of coffee to discuss leadership opportunities at Summit, with no pressure or obligations. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table watching Diane prepare dinner, while Chloe and Chase argued playfully over a television program in the other room. I felt a heavy weight in my chest. My family deserved stability, not a father who was constantly stressed about corporate politics and medical bills. After 22 years of marriage, Diane could read me like an open book. After the children went to bed, we sat on the back patio with 2 glasses of iced tea. I explained the entire meeting with Eleanor, from the empty excuses about market conditions to the refusal to adjust my salary. 15 years, Keith, Diane said softly, looking out into our backyard. You gave them 15 years of your life. You helped build that company from a tiny office to an $85 million enterprise, and they will not even give you the title you are already working under. She told me to be patient, I said. She said maybe next year, or perhaps even longer. Diane turned to face me, her eyes filled with determination. We have been patient enough. Chloe needs this surgery, Keith. Chase needs to get his medical files sorted out, and we cannot keep living on promises that never materialize. I think you should reply to Julian Pierce. If Ironclad does not value your loyalty, it is time to find a company that does. The next morning, I sent a brief reply to Julian Pierce, agreeing to meet him for coffee on Saturday morning at a quiet diner on Elm Street. On Saturday morning, I pulled into the parking lot of Murphy's Diner on Elm Street. It was a classic, low-key Texas eatery where local contractors and security personnel often grabbed breakfast before heading out to active job sites. The air inside smelled of strong coffee and fried bacon. I spotted Julian Pierce immediately, sitting in a quiet corner booth with a cup of black coffee and a folder of project summaries. He was a man in his mid-40s with a professional demeanor, and the firm, calloused handshake of someone who had spent his early career working in the field rather than sitting behind an executive desk. Keith, thank you for coming out on a weekend, Julian said as we sat down. I will get straight to the point. Summit Security Group is expanding rapidly. We have recently secured 5 new federal contracts that will launch over the next 6 months, and I need an experienced leader who can coordinate our regional operations without sacrificing our safety record. I have watched your work at Ironclad, and you are the exact leader we require. That is a significant expansion, I noted, taking a sip of the hot coffee the waitress had placed in front of me. It is, Julian replied, leaning forward, and I know you are undercompensated at Ironclad. I am prepared to offer you the position of Executive Vice President of Regional Operations at Summit. The starting salary is $145,000, which is a substantial increase from your current pay. But more importantly, we offer comprehensive family health benefits, a genuine profit-sharing structure, where you receive a percentage of the regional profits you help generate, and an education assistance program that provides $15,000 annually for college tuition for the children of our executive staff. My heart did a quick double take. $145,000. That was almost $50,000 more than my current director's salary at Ironclad. The education assistance program would cover a massive portion of Chloe's future university expenses, and the comprehensive health benefits would finally allow us to cover the $180,000 spinal surgery she desperately needed without draining our entire retirement savings. Julian was offering me the exact security and respect I had spent years pleading for at Ironclad. Why are you offering this to me, Julian? I asked. You could find someone younger, someone who would accept a lower salary. Julian shook his head. I do not want someone younger who needs hand-holding. I want a leader who knows how to coordinate federal contracts, someone who has established relationships with the regional agencies, and someone whose team would follow him into a storm. You have that reputation, Keith. Your safety record is the best in Texas, and that is due to leadership, not luck. He slid a contract summary across the table for me to review. As I looked over the detailed terms, I realized that this was the exact opportunity I had hoped to find. It was the security my family needed, and it was backed by a leader who understood the value of professional respect. I need to discuss this with my wife, Julian, I said, but I am very interested. Take the weekend, Julian replied. Call me on Monday morning with your decision. If you accept, we can finalize the paperwork next week. That evening, Diane and I reviewed the contract terms together. For the first time in years, the heavy cloud of financial anxiety seemed to lift from our home. With the higher salary and the comprehensive health coverage, Chloe's surgery could be scheduled before the end of the year, and Chase could receive the specialized leg therapy he required. There was no hesitation. On Sunday evening, I called Julian and accepted the position. On Monday morning, I walked into the Ironclad office with a professional resignation letter tucked inside my briefcase. I did not want a dramatic scene. I planned to give a standard 2 weeks' notice, complete my remaining tasks, and hand over my responsibilities in an orderly fashion. At 10 o'clock in the morning, I knocked on Eleanor's door and walked inside. I placed the resignation letter directly onto her desk. Eleanor, I am submitting my formal resignation. My last day with Ironclad will be Friday, November 22nd. Eleanor stared at the envelope as if it were a security threat. She looked up at me, her expression a mix of shock and confusion. Resignation? Keith, what are you saying? You cannot leave now. We are in the middle of renewing the federal building contract. I have accepted an executive vice president position with Summit Security Group, I explained calmly. The transition has been finalized, and my decision is complete. Eleanor's face went from pale to a deep crimson. Summit, they are our primary competitors. Keith, this is a betrayal of everything we have built here. We are like family. Family does not make empty promises for 4 years, Eleanor, I said, my voice remaining quiet and firm. Family does not fast-track a nephew who has no experience while denying compensation to the person running the entire division. I gave this company 15 years of loyal service, and you told me my promotion was on hold indefinitely. Summit offered me the position, the salary, and the respect I earned. Panicking, Eleanor leaned forward. Wait, Keith. Let's not make any rash decisions. I can speak with the board. We can match their salary. We can authorize the executive vice president title by the end of the week. You had 15 years to value my work, Eleanor, I replied, standing up. You had 4 years to process that promotion. The fact that you can suddenly authorize it today, only after I submit my resignation, proves that you were simply taking advantage of my loyalty. The decision is made. Word of my resignation spread through the halls of Ironclad Risk Management like wildfire. In the security industry, news travels fast, and by Monday afternoon, my office door had become a revolving door for colleagues wanting to confirm the rumors. As the leader of the division, I was acutely aware of the legal guidelines regarding my transition. Under Texas employment law, specifically the common law doctrine of the duty of loyalty, an employee owes a fiduciary duty to their current employer until the very moment their employment officially ends. This meant that while I was free to prepare for my new job and discuss my own departure, I could not actively solicit my coworkers to leave Ironclad, nor could I recruit them on behalf of Summit Security Group. I was determined to follow this legal doctrine to the letter to protect both myself and Julian Pierce from any potential litigation. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Preston Brooks, my operations coordinator for the last 7 years, walked into my office and closed the door. Preston was the operational backbone of our department, the guy who coordinated contractor schedules and resolved client issues before they escalated into contract penalties. Is it true, Keith? Preston asked, sitting in the chair across from my desk. Are you really leaving? It is true, Preston, I replied. I have submitted my 2 weeks' notice. My last day here will be Friday, November 22nd. I have accepted a position as the Executive Vice President of Regional Operations at Summit Security Group. Preston nodded slowly, absorbing the news. Summit is a solid company. I have worked with some of their regional managers on joint government projects. They run a very professional operation. Keith, if you do not mind me asking, are they looking for experienced operations coordinators? I looked Preston directly in the eye, keeping my voice professional and measured. Preston, you know that because I am still employed by Ironclad, I cannot solicit you or recruit you to join Summit. That would violate my duty of loyalty to this firm. However, as a colleague, I can say that Summit is growing rapidly and is actively expanding its regional operations team. I understand, Preston said, standing up and shaking my hand. Congratulations, Keith. You have earned this, and it is about time you went somewhere that recognizes your worth. Less than an hour later, Audrey Campbell, our senior intelligence analyst, knocked on my door. Audrey was a brilliant analyst who had graduated with high honors from Georgetown. She had spent 5 years transforming our threat detection capabilities. Yet, Eleanor and her executive staff routinely ignored her reports in favor of Bradley's superficial presentations. I heard the news, Audrey said, leaning against my desk. I cannot say I am surprised. I have watched them pass you over for years while taking credit for the systems you designed. What about the rest of us? If Summit is expanding, they must need analytical support. Audrey, as your manager, I cannot advise you to leave Ironclad or offer you a job at Summit while I am still on the payroll, I explained. But I can tell you that Summit values analytical excellence and invests heavily in modern intelligence infrastructure. That is all I need to know, Audrey replied with a knowing smile. On Thursday morning, the compliance officer, Randall Jenkins, stopped by my office. Randall was a former military policeman who managed our regulatory compliance and safety programs, keeping our safety numbers at the top of the industry. I heard the team is shifting, Randall said. Summit Security Group, has always had a decent compliance program, but they could use some upgrading to handle those new federal contracts. If an independent compliance officer were to submit a resume to their Human Resources Department, would it get reviewed? Randall, any growing company would be incredibly fortunate to have a compliance manager with your credentials, I said. But again, I cannot recruit you. You would have to apply through their standard channels of your own accord. Understood, Randall said. What followed was a swift chain reaction that Eleanor Vance never anticipated. On Thursday afternoon, Preston Brooks walked into Eleanor's office and submitted his resignation. An hour later, Audrey Campbell did the same. By Friday morning, Randall Jenkins had also handed in his notice. 3 of the most critical professionals in the division had resigned within less than 24 hours of each other. Entirely of their own volition, Eleanor was in an absolute frenzy. She called my office phone, her voice shaking with anger and panic. Keith, this is direct sabotage. You are gutting my company from the inside out. You recruited my entire team. Eleanor, I responded calmly, I have not recruited a single person. Every resignation you received this week was submitted independently by professionals who decided that their careers were not progressing under your management. When you treat talented people like they are disposable, you cannot be surprised when they choose to go where they are valued. This is not sabotage. It is the natural consequence of your own corporate policies. On my final Friday afternoon, I packed the remaining files, family photographs, and Marine Corps service medals from my desk into a single cardboard box. I walked out of the Ironclad building, leaving my keycard on the reception desk. I felt a profound sense of relief as I drove away. I was leaving the past behind, and my future at Summit was about to begin. My transition to Summit Security Group was like entering a completely different professional universe. The atmosphere was collaborative, the technology was state-of-the-art, and the leadership valued transparency. Within 2 weeks of my departure from Ironclad, Preston Brooks, Audrey Campbell, and Randall Jenkins had completed their transitions and joined my team at Summit. Julian Pierce welcomed them with open arms, offering competitive compensation packages and clear pathways for career advancement. Meanwhile, back at Ironclad Risk Management, the cracks in the foundation began to show almost immediately. Without the core team that had managed operations for a decade, the new managers Eleanor hired struggled to understand the complexities of our contracts. The first major failure occurred just 3 weeks after my departure. Ironclad missed a critical regulatory update on the Hamilton account because no one in their office had the established relationships with the federal inspectors to navigate the review process. That single administrative oversight resulted in a penalty of $35,000 and severely damaged their relationship with the client. Shortly thereafter, a major emergency upgrade was ordered for the downtown federal building contract due to a heightened threat level. Under the terms of the contract, Ironclad had 48 hours to mobilize response teams. Without Preston's coordination and Randall's compliance oversight, they failed to meet the deadline. The Federal Contracting Agency officially terminated the contract for default. Julian Pierce called me into his office to discuss the situation. We had to be extremely careful to avoid any allegations of tortious interference with contractual relations. Under this legal doctrine, a company can be held liable if it intentionally disrupts or induces a breach of an active, binding contract between a competitor and a client. Keith, the federal agency, has officially terminated their agreement with Ironclad due to non-performance, Julian explained. They have reached out to us to submit an emergency bid to take over the downtown facility immediately. Because the original contract has been legally terminated, we are free to step in without violating any tortious interference doctrines. I want you and your team to manage the transition. I coordinated the emergency deployment with Preston, Audrey, and Randall. We mobilized our personnel and completed the security transition within 24 hours, saving the federal agency $45,000 in projected emergency costs. The regional project manager told Julian it was the most efficient emergency transition he had witnessed in 12 years. That success solidified Summit's reputation as the premier security firm in the region. Over the next year, 4 more major clients voluntarily allowed their contracts with Ironclad to expire and subsequently moved their business to Summit. They were not solicited by us. They simply followed the team they trusted to deliver results. As Ironclad lost contract after contract, Eleanor's financial situation deteriorated rapidly. Desperate to cut costs, she implemented a sudden mass layoff, terminating over 20% of the company's workforce in a single day. However, in her haste, Eleanor completely ignored the Federal Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, commonly known as the Warnin Act. Under Title 29 of the United States Code, Section 2101, under the Warnin Act, employers with 100 or more employees are legally required to provide a 60-day written notice before conducting a mass layoff or plant closing. Because Eleanor failed to provide this mandatory notice, the laid-off employees banded together and filed a class action lawsuit against Ironclad, resulting in substantial legal fees and back pay liabilities that pushed the firm to the brink of bankruptcy. 2 years after leaving Ironclad, I sat on the back patio of our home with Diane, watching the sunset. The contrast between my life then and my life now was staggering. Chloe's spinal surgery had been a complete success, and she was currently preparing for her freshman year of college, her tuition partially covered by Summit's Education Assistance Program. Chase had completed his physical therapy and was walking without a limp, preparing to study cybersecurity at the State University. I had recently been promoted to Senior Vice President at Summit, receiving a 15% salary increase and a profit-sharing bonus that reflected the growth of our division. I did not regret leaving Ironclad for a single second. I had spent 15 years being loyal to a company that viewed me as an expense rather than an asset. By taking the risk to leave, I secured my family's future and proved that professional respect is the true foundation of leadership. Loyalty is a two-way street. When an employer refuses to honor their end of the agreement, the greatest risk is not leaving for something new. It is staying in a place that slowly drains your potential while you wait for promises that will never be kept.